thank you very much again to Andres. You've made my job extremely difficult. And to the rest of you, congratulations for having made it this far. That is also quite an achievement. I can, at this point, reassure you that I am looking forward to getting to this evening's reception as much as you are. So, when I was told that I would be given the opportunity to speak to you today, it was a fairly open-ended assignment. The topic had to be appropriate for the 25th anniversary of the Grand Lodge of Estonia, and it was warmly suggested that I tie it in somehow to the recent 300th anniversary of the first publication of Anderson's Constitutions. My first thought, obviously, would be, will I be able to speak about Estonian Freemasonry and Anderson's Constitutions for 45 minutes? My direct next thought would be that is there anyone who would want to listen to me talking about Estonian Freemasonry and Anderson's Constitutions for 45 minutes? And I have to say that we will probably find the answers to both of those questions very shortly. Initially, while that did not seem to be a terribly easy task, I started at the very beginning and picked up a copy of Anderson's Constitutions, which, as you've seen earlier today, is generally remembered for the rules and regulations that it gave to Freemasonry. But as I'm sure all of you have actually read the publication, you know that the first half of the book is actually a very grandiose Masonic history of the world, starting from the dawn of time. Afterwards, he proceeded to relate the history not just of Masonry, but of how Masons and their ideals shaped the wider history of mankind. While for some reason many consider that part of the book to be of more questionable value, I started to like the idea of examining how Masons and Masonry have affected the development of Estonian culture and the idea of an Estonian nation. At any rate, it seemed to be an appropriate challenge and perhaps even something that could warrant 45 minutes of your valuable time. Let's see. Oh, cool, there we go. So, Freemasonry has always been about bringing together men with common principles and helping them make themselves better men, and in the process, making the world a better place. The first step in a Mason's growth is understanding his own history, including that of his culture. The next step is to understand his role in actively developing history, whether as an individual or as a member of the Brotherhood. With respect to the land that we now know as the Republic of Estonia, i.e. Let's see if we can get this. No, I don't want that. There we go. The province of Old Estonia on the top here, and the northern part of Old Livonia is now what we consider to be modern Estonia. Freemasonry basically has had two incarnations, roughly 1770 to 1820, and then again from the 1990s that is, shall we say, going strong, and why we're all sitting here right now. The history of the organization was a major topic at the last conference held for the 250th anniversary of Freemasonry in Estonia, which I'm sure you all attended and all remember well. In addition to the history of Freemasonry, though, I think it's very important to actually remember the history of the Brethren themselves. On one hand, the Brethren have had a large impact on the history of the whole region. And on the other hand, global Freemasonry has had a very significant effect both on the Brethren and on the general public. Together, those two forces have played an important role in laying the foundation for the formation of an independent Republic of Estonia, as well as rebuilding it after 1991. I will spare you Anderson's history, starting with Brother Adam and continuing on through biblical history. I will also not broach upon the relationship between the Templars and the Livonian Brotherhood of the Sword, or the Teutonic Order, and any other murky connections that they may have had or may not have had to the founding of Freemasonry. I am concerned with foundations, with solid things, so I will keep my focus primarily on the impact of Masons and Masonry on Estonia and Livonia between 1717 and 1918. But I do still think it's a little bit necessary to give some background on the overall history of the region. Most of the people that I see sitting here are already intimately acquainted with the Estonian culture, but for those who are not, Estonians form a very old and relatively independent culture and have kept their language and their culture intact within a relatively small homeland for many thousands of years. As Masonic ritual is intimately tied to the history of the people of Israel, it is certainly not unfounded to notice the many parallels between the people of Israel and the people of Estonia. The strong sense of nation, the desire to pass our land and language on to our children, and the many trials brought on by unfriendly foreign powers and neighbors, all of these have led to modern nations that value education and democracy and are willing to fiercely protect them. Indeed, even as Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the kingdom of Judah and scattered the people into years of captivity and exile, between 1939 and 1949, Estonia saw a huge number of denizens scattered across to other lands. The last of the Baltic Germans and former aristocrats left at Hitler's beckon in 1939. The first Soviet deportations occurred in 1941. Huge numbers were forced to leave in 1944, and the final mass deportations to Siberia were in 1949. Those sent to Siberia were allowed to return home by 1965, some earlier. Those who fled to the west, though, had to wait until the 1990s, many of whom still live as diaspora. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the occupation, the Estonian nation was finally allowed to reunite and start rebuilding itself. And, as in ancient Israel, the Masons prepared the ground and started to build. Obviously, the roles that Freemasonry has played since 1991 has been profound, but we will save that analysis for future historians. To return to my primary focus, and a little to the style of Anderson's history, I present a brief overview of the situation at the dawn of Freemasonry in the region. By the beginning of the 18th century, when Freemasonry had started to spread across the world, Estonia and Livonia were formally part of the Russian Empire. The Estonian people, or as they referred to themselves, the people of the land, were primarily just that, serfs attached to the land physically. In modern terms, they could be considered slaves, although that sort of terminology with respect to this region is slightly anachronistic. The aristocracy here was a very interesting cultural mix, similar in many ways to that of England, inasmuch as there was a conquest in the Middle Ages, where a new aristocracy completely, with a new language, entered a society that existed. The old aristocracy quickly either assimilated with the new culture or was disposed of entirely. But with this assimilation, the new aristocracy was no longer purely German either. Over the centuries, there were influences from Denmark, Sweden, Poland, and Russia as borders of the empire shifted. But it's important to note that even under the Russian Empire, Estonia and Livonia retained an enormous amount of autonomy. Western cultural development in the Russian Empire was driven from the Baltic region, not the other way around. This multicultural, autonomous region was a perfect space for the coming of Freemasonry. And when we look at the 1770s, as those who attended the last conference remember, the application for the founding of our first lodge, ISIS in Tallinn, was in 1771. The concept of serfdom in the UK, Sweden, and because of that Finland, was foreign, as it essentially was in the northern colonies in the Americas. However, for good measure, the following were dates of the emancipation of serfs or slaves in the West. As you can see above me, France in 1789, Mecklenburg in 1807, Prussia in 1807, Estonia in 1816, Livonia in 1819, a little bit of a gap, and then Russia in 1861, and then we returned to the southern United States in 1865. So when we talk about Freemasonry, we cannot in any way get past the concept of freedom, and that concept was in no way universally understood at the time that we were discussing. In the 1770s, the bulk of ethnic Estonians were in bondage, but there was hope and there was light. Freemasonry was a tool and a catalyst for the change that has created the modern world. It's impossible to know how much this change was caused by Freemasonry and how much Freemasonry just fit with the ideals of those men who were making the change. But at the end, those were inseparable. Masonry gave a format for discussion and friendship to decision makers from all different fields who otherwise perhaps did not agree on politics or economics, who otherwise would have remained at a perpetual distance. Amongst brethren, thought was free. Freemasonry, as we know, is built on structure and symbolism. It seems appropriate, therefore, to take some of my structure from Freemasonry's ancient landmarks. These are, figuratively speaking, both immovable regulations as well as beacons leading to the light. I hope to show how some of those beacons guided what is now the Estonian people through the darkness to reach the light of independent statehood. In Estonian, that would be rahvusriik, i.e., how Masonic ideals helped the people of the land, maarahvas, to retain their identity for centuries, to maintain their culture, and finally regain political independence within the sphere of Western cultural space. If we look to the ancient landmarks, one is that a Mason must be freeborn. Given the legal base in the Russian Empire at the time, that significantly limited the potential membership of the Brotherhood. Brethren were barons and merchants, doctors and soldiers, artists and actors. Most were German-speaking, but the rest of the nation was awakening. Here, of course, I do have to mention that not all of the first brethren were Germans. There were a handful of Russians, Swedes, and Scots who had located themselves in Tallinn or in Tartu, but there were ethnic Estonians as well. Society has always allowed for exceptions, and we find brethren such as Carl Friedrich Karel. I don't have a picture of him, but what I do have is a piece, or the cover page to one of his publications of music. He was the first known ethnic Estonian composer, and also was Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's music teacher in St. Petersburg. Next we have Otto Wilhelm Masing. We have one step up. We have a profile of him, although we don't have an actual picture. He was a well-known pastor, linguist, and author, and we'll discuss him in quite a bit of detail later. And then right above me, quite an interesting character, Johan Mikkelson, or Johan von Mikkelsonen, who started out as a simple soldier and worked his way through the ranks to finally becoming general of the cavalry in the Imperial Russian Army. As with those present Estonian brethren who were born under the yoke of Soviet occupation, perhaps what was most important is that we are all born free in our minds. But to get back to the bigger picture, we should see how Freemasonry has helped to ensure the sustainability of the Estonian culture and prepare the way for the foundation of the Estonian Republic. And while this most certainly was not the plan or even the desire of the brethren at the time, it was most certainly part of a higher plan. And just as a side note, while the top part of our slide here shows the sort of mixing ground between the elite and the people of the land, the bottom shows a painting of just that, the people of the land, as it started to become more interesting and idealized among the so-called higher culture. Right. especially for Estonians, a clear distinguishing mark of culture is language. At the end of the 18th century, there were still at least two Estonian languages, the northern and the southern, and many dialects in between. Every region had its own local language, but all official business and higher culture was transacted in either German or Russian, or if at a much higher level, perhaps even in French. At that point, though, the educated elite started to become interested in the local folk stories and songs of the people. Prior to that, most of the focus of the local language was only to translate religious texts, especially the Bible, into local dialects so that the people could understand what was going on in church. However, okay, I think you went one slide too far. There we go. That was what I wanted. Johann Gottfried Herder, an academic from Königsberg, student of Immanuel Kant, friend of Goethe, and brother in the Riga Lodge zum Schwert, played a large role in starting to create interest in folk culture among the certainly academic elite, but I think amongst the cultural elite, by starting to compile and publish folk songs. His popular publication included 8 Estonian songs and their translations into German, which, while quite reserved, was an important step in creating a sense of value around folk cultures and languages. For this, and obviously for many other writings, he has been called the godfather of the Estonian national discourse. Here you can see, again, Brother Herder, roughly around the time that he was very active in Freemasonry. He was, again, based in Königsberg. Here is a very nice picture of the University of Königsberg, which was essentially the center of learning of the time. The building, I have to say, still exists. Unfortunately, it has been Russified, as with the rest of Königsberg, but it still stands as, shall we say, a landmark to where we've been. And then the frontispiece to the collection of folk songs, where the Estonian texts, as well as Latvian, were included, and which was a very important first step in creating, in modern terms, in creating a buzz amongst the academics for what had previous to that just been considered something that was very base. Now you can hit the next one. So, as interest in the Estonian language grew among the educated, it became more important to formalize it. It was a spoken language, not a written language. In order for Estonian to become living as a written language, and not just a method to transmit texts translated into it from other languages, it was necessary to agree on rules as to how it should be written down. That became a base of both literature and education. And here I think it's very important to mention Friedrich David Lenz, brother and secretary of the Zum Morgenstern Lodge in Tartu. In addition to being a pastor in the Tartu St. John's Church, he was an author, publisher, and Tartu school inspector. And as of 1803, he was the first professor of the Estonian and Finnish languages at Tartu University, and as a matter of fact, probably the first professor of both Estonian and Finnish anywhere in the world. Amongst his other achievements, he also wrote the first Estonian language handbook on gardening, very important, Ajakalender in 1796, which you can see up there next to his gravestone. As his courses were mostly intended for German-speaking pastors who needed to be able to communicate with their congregations, he taught many other brethren, including ISIS member Heinrich Georg von Jannau, who was one of the strongest supporters of using the Southern Estonian language as a base for written Estonian, instead of the Northern Estonian. He wrote several books on Estonian grammar, which you can see, Beitrage zur genauen Kenntnis der ethnischen Sprache, and über die Grand- und Ursprache der Esten. I hope that no one is offended by my German. Jana was also one of the founding members of the Learned Estonian Society, or Õpet Eesti Selts, which has been one of the driving forces in the research and preservation of the Estonian language, culture, and history since the awakening. Next, please. On the other side of the North versus South language debate was another ISIS brother, Otto Wilhelm Masing. I showed you his profile earlier. Masing was the son of an ethnic Estonian church curate and an aristocratic mother, giving him a very interesting mixed perspective. Masing wrote an Estonian language primer for children in 1795, which you can see here. A, B, D ehk lugemise raamat lastele, kes tahavad lugema õppida, in which you will note that there is no letter C because there is no letter C in Estonian. He also published a weekly newspaper, Maarahva Nädalaleht, starting from 1821, along with another Estonian brother, Hageri pastor David Friedrich Ignatius, who was a member of ISIS and zu den drei Streithammern. Incidentally, Ignatius also played a very large role in teaching the fine arts, and two of Ignatius's sons were also brothers. In the painting that you can see here, which was done by one of his students, you can see both the pastor himself sitting in the middle and his two sons, who would also later become brothers. In addition to being just a thought-provoking read for those who ordered the Nädalaleht, it also served to introduce a number of new words into the Estonian vocabulary, such as armee, ajaleht, kapital, metall, and minister, none of which existed before. Finally, after great debate, the North won, and the modern Estonian language was developed on the basis of the Northern Estonian dialect. But probably Masing's greatest service to Estonian language and literature is the development of a small but priceless mark, the letter which you can see down below. Is something that is pervasive in the language, and in that form, found nowhere else. It is difficult to think of something that is now more essentially Estonian, other than perhaps the sauna, although some in this room may choose to disagree with that. If you would. As the next, thank you. As the next iteration of the work of Herder, August von Kotzebue, brother in the lodge zu den drei Streithammern, included for the first time Estonian language text on stage. In several of his plays, including Die Väterliche Erwartung and Der Tolkus. Kotzebue on the left. In his day, he was an acclaimed playwright across Europe. We've all now heard about the origins of the term right, thank you very much. And his work was in fact performed very widely. In addition to being president of the Magistrate of Tallinn, he founded an amateur theatre in 1784, where he performed, oddly enough, many of his own works, which became the first professional theatre in Tallinn in 1809, the Revola Theatre, which its initial original building is pictured in the middle. That building, unfortunately, was destroyed in a fire and now stands underneath our puppet theatre. This, however, became the Tallinn German Theatre and worked until 1939, at which point the Estonian Drama Theatre took over their building, which is still in use today, and you can see in the final picture directly above me. It should also be mentioned that Kotzebue acted alongside Goethe in Goethe's plays, and Beethoven's Turkish March was originally written as part of the incidental music to Kotzebue's Die Ruinen von Atten, when it was performed at the opening to the new Deutsches Theater in Pest in Hungary. Altogether, Kotzebue wrote more than 200 plays, as well as numerous poems, novels, and memoirs, many of which touched upon his experiences in Estonia. But with language in place, national culture next needs education. I've already mentioned F.D. Lenz as the first university professor of Estonian and Finnish, but there was a long road to travel before he reached that position. While education had been important to the Swedish king when Estonia was under their empire, and he had greatly supported literacy amongst the commoners as a means to read the Bible, there was a gap after the Great Northern War. Tartu University, which was the second university founded in the Swedish Empire after Uppsala and before Turku and now Helsinki, but it was moved to Pärnu in 1699 and finally closed in 1710 when Pärnu surrendered to the Russian forces. The local elite did not give up on education, but they were forced to travel to Germany to get it. This did, however, have the positive side effect of allowing many Baltic Germans to join German lodges. However, there was a clear understanding that there was a need for higher education in Estonia and Livonia, and in 1802, after several years of negotiation, Tartu University was reopened. One of the main forces behind that was the university's deputy curator, Johann Friedrich Emanuel von Sternberg, who was also a past master of the Isis Lodge, honorary grand officer in the Astrea Grand Lodge, and honorary member of the St. Petersburg Lodge, Peter zur Wahrheit. While studying in Vienna in the 1780s, he was a member of the same lodge as Joseph Haydn, and which Mozart frequently attended. He was also a friend of Friedrich Schiller, who was probably a brother in German Lodge Günther zum Stehenden Löwe. The university became the center of the Tartu Education District, which also included Riga at the time, and the center of one of the 6 new educational districts in the Russian Empire declared by Alexander I. The district was governed by a curator who sat in St. Petersburg, and the first curator was Friedrich Maximilian von Klinger, who you can see up above me. He was a friend of Goethe. He was the actual author of the play Sturm und Drang, which became the calling sign of the movement of the day, and he was a member of the Zurich Lodge, Modestia cum Libertate. But as deputy curator, JFE von Sternberg was actually based in Tartu, and he was the one who worked to develop the day-to-day operations of the university and education in general. But based on the role of the upper 2 gentlemen, we certainly need to mention that the university's first rector, Georges Frédéric Parrot, was also a Mason, as was the first pro-rector and the first dogmatics and moral theology professor, Lawrence Ferdinand Ebers, as well as a number of other people who were in and around the university community at the time. One of those is Jakob Georg von Berg, chief of the knighthood and member of Isis Lodge, but I will speak about him later. His contributions were more political, but just as important in an era where education may have seemed more like a danger to the ruling class than a benefit. Through the work of the Brethren, the university was re-established and flourished. And just as a comparison, in the 19th century, Tartu University was one of 30 German-speaking languages, one of German language universities in the world. And of these, Tartu was the first one in the Russian Empire and the 11th largest overall. So in its day, it was an extremely important center of learning. Not to say that it's not today. While there were several hundred ethnic Estonians and Livonians who matriculated to Tartu University in the first decade after Restoration, it was important to start education more widely and at a younger age. Isis' brother, Paul Friedrich von Benkendorf, in addition to serving as chief of the knighthood and civil governor of Estonia, personally supported the founding of a national school teachers seminary in 1837. Thank you. Early, but thank you. So as you can see, Masons were extraordinarily interested in the passing of knowledge on to the people. Now, as we can see, after culture has demanded education, education demands research and resources. In order to facilitate education, you need to have information. In the 18th and 19th century, that meant books. As books tended to be both expensive and very unwieldy in large numbers, academics needed to have libraries. Unfortunately, similarly to the university, the Swedish-era library in Tartu was dissolved, and a new library was founded for the university in 1802. Of the first 4,000 volumes in the library, about 900 were donated by the same J.F.E. von Sternberg. In 1806, about 170 books from J.G. Herr's collection, his private library, also made their way into the university library. The first director of the library, you can see below, was Johann Carl Simon Morgenstern, who was also the first professor of rhetoric, classical philology, aesthetics, literature, and art history. He was the director of the library for 37 years and responsible for its development into a significant research library. And obviously also a brother. Upon his death, he donated his own private library, which at that time was the largest in Tartu, to the university library. From his manuscript collection, there are more than 3,000 letters from 700 correspondents, including King Frederick I of Prussia, Schiller, Goethe, and Kant. And as you can see, in true Masonic form, the building of the library, the housing of the word, was used as a pretense to restore the medieval church, in which the library was based until it became too large, and now it houses a museum of the university. But when talking about museums, in addition to the libraries, a valuable source for research and preservation are indeed museums. As a well-rounded man and mason, Morgenstern was also the founder of the Tartu University Art Library. Art Museum. Another very important museum was founded upon the collection of Brother Johannes VIII Burchard. Burchard was the town pharmacist in Tallinn. He was a member of the Burchard dynasty that operated the Tallinn Old Town Pharmacy, Rai Apteek, for 10 generations, from 1582 to 1911. In addition to being a doctor and pharmacist, he was also an avid historian and collector. His private collection, which was first publicly exhibited in 1822 in the House of the Black Heads, included objects from ancient Egypt and Rome, as well as numerous other important objects. In 1842, the Estonian Literary Society began collecting materials to found the first provincial museum. Burchard's collection was added as part of the museum, which was finally opened in 1864. That museum was in turn the basis for the Estonian History Museum, when the materials of the provincial museum were nationalized by the Soviets. In addition to Burchard's collection, many other important items made their way into the provincial museum, such as the original manuscripts for Brother Wolfgang Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 27, which was donated by artist and brother Gustav Adolf Hippius, all of which you can see above. Manuscript, which was on display, at least in the Great Guild building, as well as a portrait of Hippius and his wife, and some items from the collection of Johannes Burchard as well. Indeed, as I just mentioned, the Estonian History Museum now includes the Great Guild building in Tallinn's Old Town, as well as Maarjamäe Manor, where the museum has been kind enough to let us meet today, and in the main house of which you just enjoyed your lunch. After the dissolution of Masonic lodges by Alexander I in 1820 to 1822, it should be mentioned that the Masonic lodges in Estonia and Latvia were dissolved before they were in the rest of the Russia, obviously because they seemed to be more dangerous. Many of the families chose to donate their Masonic inheritances and archives to the provincial museum. Unfortunately, we have to admit that the new Soviet History Museum that replaced the provincial museum chose to destroy significant parts of their collections that did not align with Soviet ideology. Luckily, most of the Masonic collections were either transferred to other museums or strategically misplaced by archivists into collections that were acceptable to the Soviets and rediscovered after re-independence. And the basis of those collections were in fact, the basis of the exhibition that we had upon the anniversary of Freemasonry, the 250th anniversary that we discussed. It should also be mentioned that Johannes VIII's father, Johannes VII, was a brother initiated in Leipzig, but who joined ISIS in 1775 after his return to Estonia. His membership certificate, for those who don't believe it, is up on the screen. And for those who have enjoyed the Apteker Melker books and films, it would be reasonable to mention that a room in the Old Town Pharmacy once served as the temple for the Isis Lodge. And for those of our dear guests who join us for the tour tomorrow morning, I will be happy to show that to you. So far, we have discussed how a strong and sustainable ethnic culture developed through the Enlightenment. Local speech was formalized as a written language. With improved education, literature began to flourish. History became more valued and was preserved, both in books and museums. But the culture was not yet independent. It was curated by an upper class that had a distinct subculture. Here I cannot say that the Baltic German culture was not and should not be a part of modern Estonian culture. It was and should be. But the dominance has shifted, and that has made the culture free. That is the small miracle that allows us all to be here today. And Freemasons did not play a small role in that miracle. In the 18th and 19th century, serfdom and slavery were not at all uncommon, as previously mentioned. And while an enslaved people can have a culture, it can in no way be considered an independent culture. The views and actions of Freemasons in different countries with respect to that topic during that period would provide material for 10 conferences. However, the actual results of the efforts of the Brethren in Estonia and Livonia deserve notice. While academic discussion on the justness of serfdom and human rights started much earlier, the first major step toward freedom for the peasants, I'll use the word peasant even though it might not be considered a pretty term, it is accurate, or the people of the land, known as the farm folk as well, talurahvas. The first major step in freeing them from the land was the Vigala Peasant Law, which was signed in 1789. The same year, incidentally, as the signing of the United States Constitution. It was proclaimed by Baron VII von Uexküll at his Vana Vigala Manor, both of which you can see above. He was the chief of the knighthood, commander of the land militia, civil governor, secret advisor to the Tsar, and brother in the Zubrüderlich and Südenreich-Streithamen lodges. He was also an active supporter of the abolition of serfdom. The Vigala law, as it was known, provided for limited rights of peasants, as well as the obligation to send their children to school. It set up a municipal system for the Vigala district, including a local court with judges. Here, I would mention that one of the primary benefits of being selected as a judge was that for the period of service, you were exempted from corporal punishment. So, you were not allowed to beat the judges, at least as long as they were in service. Serfs, on the other hand, in general, were still property, and they could be bought and sold by the manor owner. But, according to this law, they could now own their own movable property, or chattels. Serfs also were given a limited right of inheritance, meaning that a serf could request that his property be inherited by his son, but the landowner still had to approve it. So it seems kind of difficult to believe that, but even when they were given the right to own something, it still wasn't really theirs. Parents were also required to teach their children to read, and if they themselves did not know how to read, then they were required to send their children to school. Baron VII
also expanded the school network within the Vigala district. And when he became civil governor of Estonia, he expanded the school system across all of Estonia. These may seem like very small steps, but opposition amongst the aristocracy was still very large. And while the law only affected one particular district, it later became the basis for many other laws giving rights to the peasants. Now, for the big step. In 1802, a codex of rights were given to the peasants across the government of Estonia, and these were colloquially known as igaüks. Here you can see the center text as part of those laws. It was marked as 1816, but igaüks started out in 1802. The laws were composed in a large part by Chief of the Knighthood, Jacob Georg von Berg, who I previously mentioned with respect to the university, and who was a member of the Lodge Isis. But the laws were finally implemented by the next Chief of the Knighthood, Gustav Heinrich von Wetter-Rosenthal. Von Wetter-Rosenthal was a very interesting character. He was often better known as Major John Rose, who, after fleeing persecution for murdering someone in a duel, went to the American colonies, fought in the American Revolution, was finally granted a pardon by Catherine II, returned to Estonia, and then became a very important force in sort of bringing the Enlightenment ideals back across the ocean to Estonia. He was also known to frequent the circles of many American Freemasons of the time, including General George Washington. There have been a number of questions as to whether or not he himself was a Mason. His own circle of friends and relatives included many Masons. In preparation for this speech, I spoke to the Grand Lodge of New York and attempted to find some proof. Unfortunately, I have not yet found that, but let that be, shall we say, a hint to the next generation of presenters. That would be a very interesting topic to look into. But the 1816 Peasants Act was a fundamental change in the status of the farm folk. Eestimaa tallurahva seadmised and Eestimaa tallurahva kässuraamat ended serfdom finally and codified the rights for the people. And there you can see the big text as warranted. As per those laws, a peasant could no longer be bought or sold, given or mortgaged individually or as a family. Peasants had the right to acquire movable and immovable property, i.e. real estate. Before that, they were real estate. And they were allowed to inherit property according to the rule of law. They were allowed to marry without permission of the landlord. That's an important thing. And upon marriage, a wife became entitled to the same rights as her husband, and children inherited their parents' rights. Now that's an interesting piece, again, as the German system of nobility more includes for rights when they're held by both parents, and in cases where one parent has fewer rights, then their descendants have fewer rights. So having the rights pass from that parent who had more rights, I think, was a very interesting and important step. A 20-year-old peasant was considered an adult and had the right to enter into contracts. Men and women were equal before the law, unless specifically determined otherwise. These laws were prepared in the second term as Chief of the Knighthood for J.G. von Berg, who was also a member of the Peasant Commission and chairman of the Provincial Legislative Committee. Fabian Reinhold von Ungern-Sternberg, a brother in the zu den Drei Streithammern Lodge, was also a member of the commission that composed the laws. And as the ideas spread, Livonia was not far behind. A similar law was approved in 1816, although coming into effect only in 1819. And again, in trend with the rest of the presentation, one of the main forces behind this law was Gustav Johann von Buddenbrock, Livonian land marshal, councillor, and mason. Another proponent was Brother Karl Otto von Transeher Rosneck, Livonian land councillor. And when we look again at the Livonian laws, I would mention that the responsibility for translating the laws into the local language was given to Otto Wilhelm Masing, whom we have also mentioned before. But here, to take the picture a little bit wider, we should note that in Europe, while the Russian Empire was the last to emancipate serfs in 1861, 40 years after the Baltic provinces, the United States ended slavery 4 years later, in 1865. Vermont was the first state to outlaw slavery in 1777, with the rest of the northern states following.
Jenkins.
But there was no consensus even among Masons. Benjamin Franklin, past Grand Master of Pennsylvania, first publisher of Anderson's Constitutions in the Americas, and opponent of slavery at the end of his life, was still most likely a slaveholder at his death. George Washington, also a slaveholder, but he made the decision to free his slaves upon his death. Even as a beacon of democracy, the United States of America was unable to resolve the issue of slavery without a bloody civil war. France was obviously no different. Even in the 1860s, the relationship between Masonry and slavery in the United States was not a simple one. One good example is Albert Pike, who most of you probably know as author of Morals and Dogma, and long-serving Sovereign Grand Commander of the Supreme Council, Scottish Rite, U.S. Southern Jurisdiction. Although as a lawyer, Pike fought successfully for the rights of Native Americans, he was later a general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, fighting against the emancipation of the slaves. There are many poignant tales of Freemasons on both sides of the Civil War, giving the appropriate signs in the battlefield to opposing forces and being spared. Some of them are true, some of them are not, but they're good stories. As a side note here, I would mention that my own great-great-great-grandfather and namesake David Jenkins was a Mason and fought for the northern states in the process of abolishing slavery in the U.S. I'm sure you can all notice the resemblance.
Yeah.
But clearly, looking at how the situation resolved itself in the United States, we should be especially grateful to our Baltic German brethren who were able to resolve the situation peacefully, granting freedom for the local people in Estonia and Livonia without significant bloodshed. The implementation of these laws in Estonia and Livonia were the foundation for the building of an independent modern Estonian nation, similarly to Latvia. But while the ground had been prepared, the actual laying of the cornerstone would still have to wait for another 100 years. Whether Alexander I's decision to close the lodges in Estonia and Livonia in 1820 played a pivotal role in that 100-year gap is open to debate. But Freemasonry continued to develop outside the Russian Empire in that period, and it still influenced the thought and helped to shift Enlightenment ideas into reality in the region here. An interesting example, again, of how Masonry brought together those who might otherwise have remained at a perpetual distance and brought together ideas and cultures that otherwise might not seem to fit together. I would bring the example of Freemason Edouard René de la Boulaye. He was a French lawyer, author, and anti-slavery activist, in addition to being a brother. As an author, he published a book of folk tales, one of which was an Estonian tale entitled The Fairy Crawfish. In this tale, a poor fisherman, Loppi, finds a magical crawfish that can grant all of his wishes. Loppi is satisfied with very small things, but his nagging wife, Maasika, is always asking more and more from the crawfish. It's a familiar tale. I won't go any farther than that. But as you can see, La Boulay's compilation of folk tales was quite popular, as was his translation of his biography, or as was his translation of the biography of Benjamin Franklin. But the primary reason that he is remembered has more to do with the statue. Edouard de la Boulaye was known as the father of the Statue of Liberty. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War in the United States, he proposed the idea of a monument for the United States to his friend, sculptor, and later brother mason Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, who was a brother in the Loge l'Alsace-Lorraine in Paris. De la Boulaye was the primary fundraiser and the driving force for placing the iconic statue into the harbor of New York. One early draft of the statue had Lady Liberty holding broken shackles in her hand. The shackles now are located at her feet, but still serve to remind us that her beacon shows the way to freedom. Every American knows at least part of Emma Lazarus's poem dedicated to the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That golden door was built by masons, and all those who have passed under Lady Liberty's torch, including the thousands of Estonian refugees after the Second World War, understand their debt to those who left the East to seek the light in the West and return. And that brings us to today. The road goes on. Thank you.